Hello, everyone. Welcome to Deep Dive into the Archive. Today, we're diving into the album.
World Eater by Blanck Mass.
Yeah.
This is Blanck Mass's third solo album coming out in 2017. This album it's a bit hard to classify in terms of genre. At its core, it's like drone electronic and experimental electronic, but there's a lot of different influences that are definitely presented on this project.
A lot of the noises and sounds that are played with on this album are very like glitchy sounding. There's a lot of use of vocal samples on this album, but like twisting them in a way so that they're constantly like being cut off and then like coming back in, and they're repeated a lot. It's very interesting how he uses all of these noises, I guess. It's very interesting how he uses all these noises to create these, I guess, like soundscapes almost, is what I'd call them a lot of the time.
They really do feel like soundscapes, and a lot of the time, these soundscapes are just packed to the brim and sometimes even overflowing with noises and samples and synths. It sounds great. It's very interesting how Blanck Mass, also known as Benjamin John Power, which I will be referring to him from now on because Benjamin John Power is a great name. But it's interesting how he is able to assemble these noises in such a way where, you really get a feel for the track. One thing that really draws me to this album is that it just has so much personality to it, which is odd for an album that's entirely it's a non-lyrical album. There's no clear lyrics on it. Like we said, there's chopped vocal samples, but no hooks or anything like that to grab onto. However, I'd say quite a lot of the tracks here, they have, synth leads or a vocal chop sample in it that I can think about the track and it plays in my head and stands out as being a very unique project, I'd say.
Definitely. I think his sound is very recognizable. I'd say it's pretty hard for someone to like mistake his sound as someone else's because it just has such an interesting feel to it, I guess. It's very noisy and often very abrasive, but in a way that's often very like bright sounding. There's a lot of like high-pitched synths throughout, and especially the use of the vocal samples makes these almost like hyperactive sounding tracks, but in a way that's, again, very noisy.
The album kicks off with John Doe's Carnival of Error, which definitely feels like an introduction to the album. It starts off more quiet, and it brings in these noises, very drony noises, and then brings in synth leads and vocal leads, and eventually you have a pretty well formed song. However, it's kind of short. There's not a ton like attracting to this track, and it definitely feels like an introduction. That being said, it is still like a 2.5 minute long introduction, but compared to the rest of the songs on this album, that is very short.
Yeah, definitely. This track has like, especially the beginning of it, has like a very like almost spacey sound to it. It's kind of ambient sounding almost with the noises that he plays with, and eventually when you add in like these vocals at the end, and as it becomes more and more noisy and chaotic, it really, I think, picks up and becomes very interesting. Will say I think the beginning of the track goes on like a bit too long. Like I wish it would progress like faster as the intro. I think this is going to be my main complaint for most of this album, is that tracks have a tendency to overstay their welcome. But once, I think, specifically for the intro, when the song starts to pick up and develop, it becomes really interesting.
And one thing I want to point out, because I'd say this track is the first time you get a taste of it, the droning noises that he uses throughout the album, this might just be like a personal thing, I don't know, but to me they have like a very natural feel a lot of the time. Like they feel like bees buzzing, but it's distorted, or like trees rustling. And I feel like Power was maybe inspired by like field recordings to create these kinds of noises or use samples. I don't even know how many of these sounds were created. They have this natural feeling to them, which is very interesting how he's able to create that. Let's move on to Reese's Negative.
I really like how the intro kind of transitions very suddenly into this track. Like, it feels very natural because it keeps this very noisy sound, like, consistent in the transition. And this track, I think, is probably the most, like, aggressive and in-your-face track on the album. It feels super intense, and as it becomes, like, noisier and as more sounds are introduced, it becomes even, like, more intense.
Yes, this is certainly one of the more noisy tracks on the album, one of the more loud tracks. And it has just this thick production on this track. It kind of feels like swampy at points. But then among all this just dense noise, there's these chopped vocal leads, which they create an excellent flow and rhythm to the track. And there are points where he's using vocal samples that are almost, they sound like they're screamed. I don't know if that's an effect or that's how they actually were. And they're contrasted with these beautiful synth melodies underneath. And it just sounds really, really interesting, really unique.
Yeah, definitely. I do really like how this track constantly, like, evolves and changes throughout its runtime. I am gonna say I do think this is the longest track on the album, and I definitely think to some extent it kind of feels that length. I wish there was maybe more experimentation done with this track, like it got changed up more throughout its runtime, or it was like cut down a bit. But I do think the ideas and sounds that are being experimented with are very interesting and very well executed.
I can definitely understand that. The track, and kind of for this whole album in general, the compositions, they take their time arriving from sound to sound. But I think overall, like, waiting, it make you wait, but it's a rewarding experience. But if there is the biggest complaint about this album, you said it earlier, that it's sometimes things take too long. For me, that is not the case on this next track, though, Please, which is thoroughly entertaining throughout, in my opinion. Please, there's this sharp transition. There's a lot of very sharp transitions on this album, but going from the very noisy, very full sounding Reese's Negative, it goes right into Please, which starts with a very minimalist synth lead in the intro.
It has a very calm feel to it. I think it's a very, like, good change in energy for the album at that point. I especially love the, like, very glitchy sounding cut up, like, vocal leads that are present throughout this track that kind of will be added and taken away, and then, like, a different vocal lead will be added and then taken away. I think it adds a very nice sound and feel to the song.
I love the way this track builds and layers the symphony of noises and melodies and samples and all these things, and they're all working so well together throughout the entire track. One thing I want to point out is, like I said earlier, these tracks have a lot of personality. This track, obviously influenced by the name Please, but there's just this sort of, like, pleading atmosphere to it.
After Please, we transition into The Rat. This has, like, this very, like, intense, like, thumping bass drum that's present throughout. I love how that is, like, complemented by these, like, harsh electric synths that come in a little bit later. Like, I don't know, I just think that, like, contrast works very well on this track. It bounces, like, very kinetic sound with the synths. I think works fantastically.
The bright and beautiful synths that are kind of like, they kind of sound scurrying at points, and they're just layered over this very, like, dark and, like, grimy percussion. It sounds really interesting. This is definitely one of the more, like, industrial sounding tracks on the album, I'd say. It's the only one without any vocal samples used. It still manages to be thoroughly entertaining. This track is really focused on the synths and the percussion, and they sound great together.
After The Rat, we transition into Silent Treatment, which starts off right away with these, like, weird kind of sounding vocals. Like, the sample it's from seems like it's from, like, a classical album or something, or like an opera.
They're very airy.
I especially love this, like, rumbling feel throughout the song, It's just like all of the elements of this track kind of like rumble with the bass as the track progresses, that I think really helps like this song's presence as you're listening to it.
I love how as the track goes along and it rumbles more and more, these like dense synths and the percussion come in over the vocals. They work together to create a great symphony of noise, and it transitions into this much more spacious like second half of the track, which is really really interesting. I feel like this track is underrated on this album. I know, like, that's weird to say, but like, Please gets all the attention and it sure deserves it, but Silent Treatment, this is like one of the more catchy tracks on the album.
Silent Treatment's probably my favorite song, so yeah, I definitely think this is like the track to check out from this album, personally. I mean, like, personally, up until this point on the album, I think all the previous tracks kind of, for me, have the problem of, again, overstaying their welcome. But, like, Silent Treatment is the one where I don't think it does at all. Like, I think the way that all of these elements, like, evolve throughout the track is just super interesting and engaging, like, throughout.
I definitely agree. I love Silent Treatment. The next track is an amalgamation of 3 shorter tracks: Minnesota, Ies Fours, and Naked. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing Ies Fours. It's a waterfall in Scotland, apparently. And I can't speak Scottish. But these tracks definitely feel separate. There's 3 distinct sections to this track. There's the intro, which is some very just like raw noise. Then this noise fades away and it comes in with these very calming synths and vocal samples, and then these give way to kind of a vaporwave sounding end to the track.
I really love the Minnesota intro. It has like this like weird alien sound to it almost. It just makes for a super interesting like soundscape to start off the track. And I do like the ES Force. I do like the second part of the track, but I will say it sounds a lot like a Tim Hecker song. It was like very apparent to me that it was inspired by Tim Hecker. It reminds me a lot of something off of like Virgins or Rave Death, 1972.
This track is probably one of my more least favorites. I think individually these sections aren't bad. I don't think they work together incredibly well, and I also think this track is by far the one that least mixes up its influences.
Yeah, definitely. This is probably the least like distinct out of all the tracks.
The album arrives to a close with Hive Mind. The production on this track, I just enjoy how many samples and how many noises are going on. There's like these barely audible samples in the background, and you can really tell that all these small production pieces are adding a lot to the sound as a whole.
I really like the contrast that's kind of made. There's these like rolling synths that are throughout the track, and they contrast quite a bit with the very harsh like percussion beats that happen, and I think that works really well.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. This track really has a sense of finality to it. I think it's very fitting as the closer to this album.
Over the course of its runtime, it like becomes like harsher and more like overwhelming, cacophonous in its sound, which I think really works for it as a closer.
Thinking about the amount of work that he had to put into creating this album, it's kind of overwhelming because, like we said, the production on this album is absolutely stunning in my opinion, and it's just an incredible piece of production work. There's so many different samples used to create all these different atmospheres throughout the album, and they all work well together when combined on this one project. And despite not having lyrics, you can really come away from this album with a sense of what kind of things Powers was trying to convey. If you look into like what he has said about the album, he's trying to convey the inner beast of like man, which you don't have to come away from the album with that takeaway. You can just be like, wow, that's some cool electronic music. I feel like if you try and get a feel for that, it's present.
Yeah, I just think this is a very interesting, unique sounding electronic album. I definitely think it's like worth checking out for sure. It's a very interesting electronic project. I do think that quite a few of these tracks overstay their welcome in terms of length, and I wish that more experimentation was packed into a lot of them, but I still think it's a very interesting electronic album that just does so much with its production and has such a unique style. Personally, I think this album's like a 7.5 to an 8 for me. I just think it's a really engaging and well executed album.
I'm very much in love with this album. I find myself coming back to it time and time again because of how unique it is, because it has such great personality. It can be a bit abrasive at times, and it can also, if you're not fully engaged in the compositions, it can overstay its welcome, certainly. Personally, I don't really find myself having too many problems with the record overall. I find it a very enjoyable listen. It's an album I keep coming back to. I would very much recommend it if you're looking for some kind of weirder electronic music. I give it like a 9 out of 10.
Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed this review, why not check out some of our other deep dives into the archives? Or you can also go check out our other series, Album Swap. We got some interesting episodes coming up for it. So, yeah, also please like and subscribe, and I hope you have a good day.